So now we've learned about the alert zones. Let's talk about the trigger setup and the rest of the way the system is going to kind of get set up to trigger you into the trade. So once we have got all of the criteria met, if and only if all of your criteria are met, in other words, the trade has come into the alert zone, all the criteria is met, we're above the clouds or we're below the clouds, whatever the criteria is, we've got all the criteria met. Once that is done, now we set the trigger, and the trigger says, if I hit this price, then I'm going to go into the trade, bullish or bearish, whatever that trigger is set for. Here's the way we're going to do it. We're going to set the trigger to enter the trade. It's going to be a swing high or a swing low point plus this thing that we call a buffer. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide here. So it's a swing high or low plus the buffer. And of course, you're going to set the trigger above the price if you're bullish and below the price if you are bearish. Now, let's talk about this issue of the buffer. What is a buffer? A buffer is a certain amount of space that you're going to give just to make sure that intraday swing highs and lows, those upper and lower shadows in your candlesticks, just to make sure that they don't trigger you into a false trade. So how do we set a buffer? The buffer is going to be the amount that you put in there between your swing high or low point and your trigger point to allow for that intraday volatility. Usually, it needs to be about a third to a half of the average true range. Now, I'm trying to come up with a quantitative way that you can create this system. For myself, for years, I've just kind of visually done this, but a couple of years ago, some students were really needing a more quantitative way to do this, say, I need a way that I can set a hard and fast entry point here. And so I started playing with the average true range, and what I found is, for this particular setup, most of the time, if you look at the average true range, you put that on your chart, you look at the value of that, and you take about a third to a half of that, that is normally going to be about what you need for your entry buffer. Now, if you want to visually do it, like I've done it for years, you're welcome to do that. Or if you want to get a more precise number, kind of a little bit more quantitatively, just look at your average true range and take about a half to a third of whatever that average true range is and use that as your buffer here. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Notice the trade here. So we get set up to get into the trade. The trade comes up, it alerts us, and it says, hey, a bullish trade is likely. Now we say, okay, well, where's my entry? Now I need to come over here, look at my entry, my swing high point, and I need to add a few pips to that to get into the trade. That's going to be my buffer. So I look down here at my average true range, and if I look at my average true range and I come up with a number for that, I add that to my swing high point, and that becomes my entry trigger. All right, now, this is a really good way of setting your trigger. We're going to go through it in more detail here in just a minute. I'm just kind of showing you the overview right now. It's a really good way of setting your trigger because it gives you a quantitative way to sit here and say, here's my swing high point. If I add this many pips, that's going to be about a half of the average true range. That should be enough of the typical intraday swing. And more often than not, it will work for you. Is it perfect? No, but nothing is perfect. It's just going to be pretty good for you, all right? Now, let's talk about stops. Stops are an essential part of your trading system. They need to be a little bit loose, initially speaking, because they need to give the trade room to run. And this is one of the things that people have a really difficult time with when setting stops, especially early in a trade, especially if it's a longer term trend trade. People want to set those stops, they want to snug them right up so they don't have any risk of losing money. And that's the way personalities work. But that's not the way the trades work. The better way to set it is to give it a little bit of breathing room right at the beginning. You're never going to have as much risk in a trade as you do the moment you place it. After you place the trade, you start putting the stops in and tightening up, and that risk is going down substantially because you're tightening those stops up. But that first day you get into the trade, that's when you have the maximum risk exposure. So what people want to do is they want to tighten the stop and make it really, really tight so they don't have that risk. Don't do that. Avoid that temptation. Give it some space. Give it some room here so that it can kind of shake itself out. And you're just going to have to learn to hold through some of those retracements and trust the system here. So with this particular setup, we're going to set the stop a little bit loose. When you see the possibility of slowdowns, you're going to need to tighten the stop. Tighten the stop up when you start to see a slowdown, especially if you start to see candlesticks telling you to get out of the trade. And here's a really important key. Only tighten your stop. Do not loosen it. Never, ever, ever loosen your stop. If you start off with a 100 pip stop, don't come back behind it and say, oh, I'm going to stop out in 10 pips. I better loosen it up a little bit. No, 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 no. The whole purpose of having the stop is to protect you and to get you out of the trade. So put your stop in there. If it turns out that you're consistently setting stops too tight, then you can adjust your trading system, but don't adjust your plan on the fly here. Put your stops in there, and if you're going to stop out, then you're going to stop out. But you should only adjust to make your stop tighter. Never adjust to make your stop looser and expose yourself to more risk just because you're afraid of getting out of the trade. Now, let's also remember the signals that we're going to get. We're going to have a future signal, we're going to have a current signal, and of course we got the historical signal. Those are the three components that we get from the Ichimoku clouds. And now let me go through the signals here. Let's just really quick recap the signals. Recapping of the signals here with the Senkou, price is above the cloud, it's bullish, below the cloud, it's bearish. If it's in the cloud, it's bullish, below the cloud, it's bearish. Of course, if you got thick clouds, likely consolidation, thin clouds, potential turning. And if the entire, or not if the entire cloud, but I should say the entire cloud, the entire cloud is a support and resistance area, and a flat Senkou B is support and resistance. So there's a quick recap of the Senkou signals. Here's the Tenkan and the Kijun signals. Above the Tenkan and the Kijun is bullish, below is bearish. Tenkan both, if they're both up, it's bullish. If they're both down, it's bearish. If they're converging, it's short-term consolidation. A Tenkan Kijun cross is a buy or sell signal. Of course, the Tenkan is the 9-day, and the Kijun is a 26-day support and resistance. And then finally, with the Chikou here, with the Chikou, if you're above the candles 26 days ago, you're bullish. If you're below them, you're bearish. If you're above the clouds, you're bullish. If you're below them, you're bearish. And if the Chikou is running into the candles, it's consolidation. If it's running into the clouds, it is consolidation. So there's a quick recap. Now what we're going to do, I've got two slides here of the rules, how we set the stops, all these rules. This is the actual trading system here. We're going to go through that, and then we're going to go over and start actually doing the historical trading and testing the system.